He didn't bark. He didn't run. He just lay there, like a small, trembling shield, blood dripping from his paw into the dry leaves. The sun was high and cruel over the Oregon woods, the kind of heat that turned silence heavy. And there he was, a 5-month-old German Shepherd puppy, sprawled across the fragile body of a dying fawn. When we first saw them, none of us spoke. We'd been called in after hikers heard what they thought were coyotes, sharp, ragged cries deep in the forest. I expected a routine wildlife call, maybe an injured raccoon. Instead, we walked into a scene that felt too deliberate to be nature. Blood on the thorns, tufts of fur clinging to rusted barbs of a collapsed fence, a fawn barely breathing, legs scraped raw, too weak to move. And the puppy, his ribs sharp under a dirt-matted coat, his eyes clouded with something I couldn't name. When I stepped forward, he growled, low and rough, not out of fear, but as if to say, "One more step, and I will protect her with everything I have left." I froze. My breath caught somewhere between instinct and disbelief. "Is he guarding her?" Someone behind me asked. "He's not guarding," I said quietly. "He's choosing." The puppy shifted just slightly, pain shooting through his injured paw. But he didn't back away, didn't even glance at us. His whole body stayed curled around her, like that spot beneath his chest was the safest place on Earth. "My name is Jamie Collins. I'm part of a small rescue unit just outside Eugene, Oregon, specializing in wildlife distress calls and rehabilitation. I've seen animals caught in barbed wire, left in traps, mauled by predators. I thought I had seen it all, but this was different." I crouched low, keeping my hands visible. "Hey, buddy," I said softly. "I see you." He snarled once, lips pulling tight, but his eyes never held aggression. Only warning. And behind it, pain. Not just physical, something else, the kind you don't expect from a puppy. His paws torn up. My partner Leo whispered, "Should we sedate him?" "No," I said without thinking. "He's not the one dying." The fawn, maybe a few weeks old, let out a weak, broken bleat. Her tiny legs twitched once, then stilled. She was going fast. We had minutes, if that. I radioed the wildlife team, told them to bring everything they had. Then I did the only thing I could. I waited with him. 10 minutes passed. Maybe more. The puppy didn't move, except to occasionally nuzzle her ear with his nose, licking gently. He trembled from exhaustion, from heat, from pain. But he never left her side. When the wildlife team finally arrived, we moved in slow. No sudden motions. I kept whispering to him as they set up the stretcher. "It's okay. We've got her now. You did enough." But I was wrong. He wasn't done. When they lifted the fawn, now named Clover, he tried to stand. His legs buckled. He pushed again, this time dragging himself forward, blood from his paw streaking across the dirt. And then, somehow, he got up. He followed, all the way to the edge of the clearing. Limping, head low, one paw half useless. And when we reached the van, he sat down next to the back wheel and refused to move. A wildlife officer looked at me. "He's your problem now." "I'll take him," I said, already reaching for a blanket. "His name's Ranger." It felt right. Not a pet name. A title. I loaded him into my Jeep with careful hands. He didn't growl this time, didn't resist. But he didn't look at me either. His eyes stayed fixed on the woods, like he'd left something behind that mattered more than his own safety. At home, he wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. He paced the living room in tight, silent circles, then curled up by the front door, nose pressed to the gap under the frame, waiting. That night I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw them, 2 babies in the dirt, one bleeding, the other dying, both forgotten by the world, until they found each other. The next morning, I found him still lying there, eyes wide, breathing shallow. My 14-year-old son Luke crept downstairs, barefoot and cautious. He stopped at the bottom step and stared. "He's huge," Luke whispered. "He's a baby," I said. Ranger didn't move, but his ears flicked. He looked at Luke, then turned away. It hit me then. This wasn't fear. This was grief. He hadn't just stayed with Clover. He'd suffered for her, chosen her. And now, with her gone, he wasn't sure how to be anything else. Later that day, I carried him into the vet's office. He didn't fight the examination. He stood, still and silent, while they treated his paw, cleaned the gash under his chest, shaved the scarred spots on his side. No microchip, no collar. But these scars, they're not from the woods. The vet said, "He's been tethered, maybe abused, then dumped." I swallowed. "How did he survive this long?" The vet paused, glanced at Ranger. "Instinct," she said, "or something stronger." Driving home, I caught him watching the trees pass. Not panicked, not curious, searching, as if he still wasn't where he belonged. Then, just once, a sound escaped him, a soft, broken whimper. I reached my hand toward the back seat. "I know, Ranger, I know." That night, he didn't pace. He didn't sleep, either. He just lay beside the door, eyes open, staring into the dark, waiting. And in the silence, I finally understood. This wasn't a puppy who got lost in the woods. This was a soul who stayed behind, for someone else. And he wasn't done yet. The house had never been this quiet. Even after everything, after the loss and the grief that seemed to hang from the corners of every room, it had still felt like a home. But now, with the German Shepherd puppy curled by the door, silent, unmoving, it felt like something else entirely. A waiting room. A place between then and now. Jamie Collins leaned on the kitchen counter, staring through the window into the backyard as the morning sun pushed long shadows across the grass. Ranger hadn't moved all night. She'd laid out a blanket, filled a bowl with food, even sat beside him at one point. But the puppy only lifted his head once to glance toward the trees, and then tucked it back onto his front paws. Not asleep, not relaxed, just waiting. Jamie rubbed her face, trying to shake the tension building behind her eyes. 14 years of being a nurse, of losing patients and holding hands in hospice rooms had taught her how to read silence. And whatever was happening inside that dog, it wasn't just instinct. It was something deeper, something she'd seen before. After Nathan died, her husband, her anchor, there were nights when Luke would curl up beside the front door, clutching one of Nathan's old flannels. He wouldn't cry, wouldn't speak, just press his face to the hardwood and wait for something that was never coming back. The way Ranger lay now, it was the same. Luke came down the stairs, socked feet soft on the steps, hair tousled from sleep. "He still hasn't moved?" Luke asked, his voice low. Jamie shook her head. "Not an inch." The boy crouched near Ranger but didn't reach out, just watched. "He's not scared," Luke said after a while. "He's listening." Jamie looked at him. "To what?" "I don't know," Luke said. "But it's not us." Jamie knelt beside them. Ranger's ears twitched. He lifted his head a little, just enough to acknowledge them, then rested it back down again. His eyes weren't blank. They were holding something, like the last flicker of a candle that refuses to go out. That afternoon, Jamie drove him back to the clinic for a follow-up. The vet, Dr. Mendoza, was kind but clinical, running gloved fingers along Ranger's stitched paw and checking his temperature. Ranger didn't growl, he didn't flinch, but he never looked at her either. "He's healing well, physically," Dr. Mendoza said. "But emotionally, that's another story. Any idea where he came from? No chip, no ID, but the abrasions around his chest and neck are consistent with being tied up for long periods. The raw patch under his leg, likely from a rope or chain. He didn't get those from barbed wire. Jamie swallowed. So someone did this. Or let it happen. Ranger let her lift his front leg without a sound. She didn't need him to whimper. The scars said enough. Back home, she left the back door open for air and sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea she didn't plan to drink. Ranger lay just inside the threshold, not quite out, not quite in. Like he didn't belong to either world. Luke joined her a few minutes later, barefoot, carrying his sketch pad. "I drew them," he said, flipping to a page. It was rough but unmistakable. Ranger curled around the tiny fawn in the leaves, their bodies pressed together like halves of a single thought. Jamie stared at the image. That's exactly how it looked. "He didn't have to stay," Luke said. "I know." "So why did he?" Jamie didn't answer, because she wasn't sure yet. But deep down, something in her knew. The answer had nothing to do with survival. That night, Ranger left the door and padded slowly across the room. He didn't go to his blanket. He didn't approach anyone. Instead, he lay down beside the small wooden chest near the fireplace, the one that held Nathan's medals, letters, and the faded green beanie he used to wear during winter hikes. Jamie felt her heart seize. He rested his head on the chest, eyes closed, breathing slow. She wanted to say something, to call him, or maybe just whisper, "Thank you." But the weight in her throat was too heavy. The next day, Ranger refused breakfast again. Jamie tried everything, boiled chicken, broth, even hand-feeding, but he only sniffed and turned away. It wasn't rejection. It was distraction. Every sound outside drew his attention. A branch creaked. A squirrel rustled leaves. A car engine several blocks away sputtered and died. Every time, his ears snapped up. His body tensed. But nothing ever came through the door. Until the doorbell rang. Ranger leapt to his feet, not barking, not growling, just completely, unnervingly alert. He didn't move forward. He simply stood like a statue, muscles rigid, eyes locked. Jamie opened the door to find her friend Karen from the rescue center holding a phone. "Jamie," she said, breathless, "you need to see this." She played a voicemail. A hiker from 2 counties over had reported seeing a limping German Shepherd pup dragging something from a collapsed fence line. It had been called in days before the rescue, but somehow the timing matched. Then Karen added, "That fence. It borders private hunting land, and the owners aren't known for being gentle." Jamie's stomach turned cold. "Are you saying someone might have hurt both of them?" Karen nodded, and left them there. Jamie looked down at Ranger, who had returned to the chest. His breathing was faster now, ears lowered slightly. "You think he tried to pull her out of that fence?" Karen looked at her. "I think he chose to stay with her when no one else did." That night, Jamie couldn't sleep. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring into the hallway, where Ranger lay like a sentinel, half in shadow, half in moonlight. She thought of everything he'd survived. The pain, the hunger, the long nights with no guarantee of help. But he hadn't just waited. He had fought, stayed, protected, and now he was here. Not because he wanted comfort, but because maybe, just maybe, he still didn't trust the world to keep the ones he loved safe. Jamie wiped her face with the back of her hand and whispered into the dark. "You don't have to protect us, Ranger." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure it was true, because some guardians aren't trained. They're chosen, by grief, by instinct, by love. It started with a flick of his ear. Jamie had just stepped off the back porch, coffee in hand, half distracted by the morning chill, when Ranger's head snapped toward the tree line. He wasn't barking, wasn't pacing, just standing there at full attention, like someone had called his name in a language only he understood. "Ranger?" she called softly. He looked back at her once, just once, and then turned toward the woods. No hesitation, no second glance. He started walking. Jamie didn't think. She dropped her mug, heard it shatter behind her on the concrete, and grabbed the leash from the hook. But by the time she caught up, he was already halfway down the trail behind the house, moving fast, tail stiff, body low to the ground. Not frantic, not hunting, focused. She followed, heart thudding against her ribs. The morning was too quiet. Even the birds felt like they were holding their breath. "Ranger, slow down," she said, but he didn't. He wasn't pulling out of panic. He was leading, like he knew exactly where he was going. And he did. The trail turned sharply near the edge of a ravine, where the trees grew thicker and the light turned green and dappled. Jamie hadn't walked this far in weeks, not since the call about the pup and the cries in the woods. She hadn't had reason to, but Ranger did. He stopped just past a bent-over cedar, nose working the air. Jamie caught up, out of breath. "What is it?" Then she saw it. The fence. Rust-warped and half-collapsed, it curled like a broken rib cage out of the underbrush. Metal teeth jagged where something had once tried to push through. Tufts of soft tan fur still clung to the lowest wires. The dirt beneath was churned up, dark, scarred. Drag marks! Jamie's stomach dropped. Ranger walked straight to the spot, nose low, pawing gently at the earth. Then he stopped, lowered himself down, laid his head on his paws, not resting, remembering. Jamie stepped closer, crouching next to him. The ground smelled of rust and old pain. There were claw marks in the dirt, deep, desperate scratches where something small had fought to stay or to save. She glanced at the fence again. The spacing between the lower wires was too narrow. A young deer wouldn't have gotten through easily. If the fawn had panicked, tried to leap or crawl, she could have been caught, torn open. And judging by the dried blood, she had been. Ranger shifted beside her and nosed the ground again, this time toward the fence line. Another drag mark, only this one angled away from the fence. Something had been pulled, moved, or someone had tried to move it. Jamie leaned forward, heart hammering. The marks weren't random. They were deliberate. Short, staggered tracks where the dirt had been pushed and pressed in intervals, like a dog using his chest and front legs to drag something behind him. She stared at Ranger. "You tried to get her out." He didn't move, but his eyes told her everything. It hadn't been luck that left the fawn still breathing when they arrived. It had been him, injured, abandoned, starving. And he stayed. Jamie blinked against the sudden heat behind her eyes. This wasn't just a case of a dog stumbling across another animal and lying down beside it. Ranger had worked for her, bled for her, and made a decision. He could have run, he should have, but instead he stayed in the dirt, under the sun, for hours, maybe longer, pulling, guarding, waiting. Jamie scanned the area again and found more evidence. Bits of skin caught on the fence, likely Ranger's, and fresh scabbing under his front leg, exactly where he would have pressed against the metal. The wound made more sense now. It hadn't come from running through brush. It had come from trying to rescue her. She stood slowly, dusting her hands. "You knew she couldn't make it alone, so you didn't leave." Ranger lifted his head, not in acknowledgement, not in pride, but like he was giving her permission to understand. Jamie stepped closer and knelt beside him. "But why, Ranger? Why her?" He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But he leaned against her leg, lightly, briefly, and then pulled back again, turning his gaze back to the fence. Jamie heard herself exhale a sound halfway between a sob and a breath. Then she heard something else, a crack, in the woods behind them. Ranger's head snapped up. Jamie turned quickly, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but Ranger was already on his feet, body tense, nose flaring. He stepped forward once, tail straight behind him. Jamie caught his collar gently. "What is it?" Another sound, closer now, a soft rustling, like leaves being disturbed from the inside. Jamie braced herself. A small grey bird fluttered from the brush and darted up into the trees. Ranger's posture relaxed. Still, Jamie didn't move. Something in her gut twisted. This wasn't random. He hadn't brought her here on a whim. There was still something left behind in this place. A scent, a memory, or maybe a promise. They stood there for another minute. Ranger didn't sniff anymore. He didn't dig. He just stared at the patch of earth beneath the rusted fence. The place where a baby deer had nearly died, and where a puppy had chosen not to run. Jamie felt the weight of that choice settle inside her. She'd seen soldiers come home with 1,000-yard stares. She'd held patients who'd survived car crashes but couldn't remember how to move their hands. She knew trauma, but she'd never seen it in a dog like this. Quiet, heavy, alive. As they turned to leave, Ranger glanced back once, just once, at the place where he'd waited. Not for pity, not for praise, but for someone to save her. And Jamie finally understood. He hadn't just saved that fawn, he'd saved himself. And maybe, just maybe, he was about to save them too. Jamie told herself it was the responsible thing to do. She stood on the porch as the van from the rescue center rolled down the gravel path, tail lights flickering through morning mist. Ranger sat in the back, eyes locked on her through the window, unmoving. No barking, no scratching. Just still. Like he'd already accepted it, as if this kind of goodbye wasn't new. Jamie's arms hung limp by her sides, fists tight but useless. She waited until the van disappeared around the bend before going back inside. The quiet hit harder than it should have. She didn't cry. Nurses learn to compartmentalize. Mothers do it out of necessity. Widows, out of survival. And she'd done it all. She moved through the motions of the day, checking emails, folding laundry, restocking the fridge, telling herself that she'd made the right choice. That a dog like Ranger, with his trauma, his scars, his silence, didn't belong in a house with a teenager who still had night terrors. But that was a lie. The moment she closed the door behind her, she felt it. A new absence. Not grief like Nathan's, not the messy ache of widowhood. This was something else. Something that looked like guilt and smelled like regret. When Luke got home from school, he dropped his backpack by the door and kicked off his shoes. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes scanned the floor, the hallway, the living room. "Where is he?" he asked. Jamie turned from the sink, drying her hands slower than she needed to. "Back at the center. I thought it would be safer." "For who?" She didn't answer. Luke sat at the kitchen table, legs bouncing. He pulled out his sketch pad, but the pencil just hovered. No lines, no motion. "You didn't even talk to me about it. I didn't think I needed to," Jamie said, then softened. "He's been through a lot, Luke. He needs professionals. He's not just any dog. That's why he should have stayed," Luke said quietly. Jamie leaned on the counter, the silence between them loud. The clock ticked in the background like it was counting the moments she couldn't take back. Luke didn't look at her when he spoke again. "If I was hurt like that fawn, and someone stayed with me even though they didn't have to, and then someone took them away..." His voice trailed off. Jamie felt something inside her slip. "If it were me," he finished, "I'd want them to stay, even if it hurt." Jamie opened her mouth but found no words. He didn't leave her, but we left him. Luke stood and walked towards the stairs, his sketchpad still closed in his hand. Just before he reached the top, he turned back. Maybe he was the first one in a long time who knew what it meant to stay. The door to his room clicked shut. Jamie sat down on the couch and stared at the floor. Her palms were damp, her chest tight. That kind of tight that starts behind your ribs and works its way up until it chokes the space between reason and instinct. She thought she'd been protecting her son, guarding the fragile peace they'd fought to rebuild after Nathan died. But maybe peace didn't always come from silence. Maybe sometimes it came from the presence of something or someone who refused to leave. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house felt colder, though the thermostat hadn't changed. The couch creaked under her shifting weight. The hallway moaned with the kind of creaks she used to tune out. And the door stayed shut. Ranger wasn't there. She caught herself glancing towards the corner where he used to lie, waiting like a soldier off duty. His blanket was still there, untouched. She hadn't moved it. Couldn't. By 2 a.m., Jamie was standing barefoot in the kitchen, hands around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, eyes scanning the moonlit woods beyond the window. She didn't hear Luke come downstairs. He stood behind her quietly, arms crossed. He didn't even try to run. Luke said. Jamie turned. He just let you take him. There was no accusation in his voice, just truth. That's what got me, he continued. I think he's used to people leaving, but he still stayed. Jamie leaned on the counter, shoulders sagging. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Luke. You're doing what you always do, he said, trying to protect everyone. But Ranger doesn't need protecting. He needs a place to stay. Jamie looked at him. Really looked. Her son, still too thin, still too quiet, still healing, wasn't asking for a dog. He was asking for something neither of them could name out loud, something Ranger had already been. I'll call them in the morning, Jamie whispered. We'll bring him home. Luke didn't smile. He just nodded, like something in him had been waiting to exhale. As he turned to go back upstairs, Jamie said, You saw him more clearly than I did. Luke paused on the steps. Maybe we both just needed someone to remind us how. Jamie stayed there for a long time, the tea gone cold in her hands, the world just a little quieter, but not empty. Not anymore. The phone call came just after noon. Jamie had been standing in the laundry room, folding one of Luke's old t-shirts, thin at the seams, the kind that should have been thrown out years ago. It was the silence that made her look up, that hush you feel before something changes. She grabbed her phone on the second ring. Jamie Collins? A woman's voice asked. Yes. This is Margot from the Willamette Wildlife Center. You brought in the fawn. Jamie's heart skipped. Clover, yes. Is she? She's alive, Margot said quickly. But we're concerned. Jamie leaned against the doorframe. What's wrong? She's not eating. Barely responds to touch. No defensive movements. We've ruled out infection, and her vitals are holding steady. But it's like she's disconnected. There's no spark. It's like she's waiting for something. Jamie didn't speak. There's one more thing, Margot added after a beat. She reacts strangely to dogs barking nearby, freezes, not in fear, more like awareness, recognition. Jamie's breath caught. She was never alone. She whispered, The puppy, Ranger, he stayed with her. There was silence on the other end. He didn't just keep her warm. Jamie continued. He kept her alive, mentally, emotionally. She's waiting for him. You think she remembers him? I think she never forgot. Jamie's eyes drifted to the hallway, where Ranger now lay in his usual spot, just near the back door, head between his paws, staring out into the trees. He hadn't moved much since coming home. ate when Luke fed him, rested when the house was quiet. But something in him still stayed locked up, just beyond reach. Margot hesitated. This isn't protocol. We don't usually allow direct interaction between wildlife and domestic animals, especially during recovery. I understand, Jamie said. But this isn't usual. The line was quiet again. Then Margot exhaled. If we approve it, it has to be controlled. Monitored. Of course. We'll call you with a time. Jamie hung up and turned to Ranger. He was already watching her. 2 days later, they pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Wildlife Center under a pale blue sky. Ranger sat silently in the back seat. No leash, no trembling, just stillness. That same alert posture he had worn in the woods the day Jamie found him. She opened the door. He didn't jump. He stepped down like he was walking into something sacred. A handler met them outside. You're Jamie? And this is Ranger. The woman nodded, then glanced at the German shepherd pup who stood like a soldier beside Jamie's leg. He's bigger than I expected. He's more than he looks. They led them along a stone path to the outdoor enclosure. Shade cloth stretched overhead. Clover lay in the far corner, her body barely visible through tall straw and dappled light. She's resting, the handler said. No changes in the last day. We'll keep him outside the fencing. Jamie knelt beside Ranger. She's there. He didn't move, until Clover shifted. Not much, just a tilt of the head. Ears pricking, eyes opening. Ranger stepped forward. He stopped inches from the chain-link fence, nose twitching, tail low, but steady. Then Clover stood. It wasn't graceful. Her legs wobbled. She took one small, unsure step, then another. Jamie heard the breath catch in the handler's throat. Clover made her way to the fence, and paused. Ranger lay down slowly. No bark, no whine, just presence. Then Clover reached through, barely, delicately, and brushed her nose against the metal. Ranger responded with a single, low woof. Quiet, grounded, like a promise fulfilled. The handler wiped her eyes without a word. Clover didn't step back. She lingered. Her body leaned into the fence like it remembered what safety once felt like. And Ranger, who had spent days staring at the back door, unmoving, looked up at her like the last piece of something had finally returned. Jamie couldn't breathe. This, the handler whispered. I've never seen anything like this. He didn't just protect her, Jamie said, her voice low. He anchored her, when no one else did. For the next 45 minutes, neither animal moved much. Clover lay in the grass again, but this time with her head up, watching Ranger. Her ears twitched when he shifted. Her eyes followed him when he blinked. She even nibbled at the bottle when it was offered. She hasn't done that in days, Margot said quietly from behind them. She needed to know he was real. Jamie murmured. When it was time to go, Ranger resisted. Not a full fight, just a slow stiffening of the legs, a refusal to turn. Jamie knelt beside him. I know, she said gently, but she's okay now. He looked back once, just once. Clover remained still, but her ears stayed pointed toward the exit until Ranger disappeared down the path. Back at the car, Ranger curled up on the back seat. Not in guard mode, not staring out the window, just resting. Breathing. Jamie glanced at him in the rear view. You kept her alive, Ranger, she whispered. Now it's your turn. He didn't respond, but for the first time since they'd met, he closed his eyes. And slept. The second visit wasn't supposed to happen. Margot had called Jamie reluctantly, with that tone professionals use when they're out of options, but too careful to admit it. Clover wasn't eating again. She'd regressed, curled tighter into herself, flinched at light, turned her head at every offering of food. "She's shutting down," Margot said. "We don't know why. Everything looked hopeful after Ranger came, but now it's like she's given up again." Jamie didn't hesitate. "Can we bring him back?" There was a pause on the other end. "It's not recommended," Margot finally said, "but I've seen enough to believe. Maybe this time protocol doesn't apply." The next morning, before the sun fully rose, Jamie opened the back door. Ranger was already sitting there, like he'd known. He didn't look at her, just stood, ready. She drove with the windows down. The air was cool, full of mist and pine. Ranger stood in the back seat the entire time, eyes forward, ears twitching at every curve of the road. At the wildlife center, the staff led them straight back to the enclosure. "She's in the same spot," the handler said. "Hasn't moved in hours." Jamie looked at Ranger. "Let's try." As they approached the fencing, the first thing she noticed was Clover's stillness. She lay like a dropped branch in the corner, her chest barely rising. Ranger slowed. Then stopped. For a moment, everything held still. The trees, the wind, even Jamie's breath. Then Clover stirred. It was barely visible. A twitch of one ear, a lift of the head. Her nose moved, slow and uncertain, like waking from a dream she didn't trust. Ranger stepped closer. No leash, no commands, just a silent approach like he was walking into memory. And then it happened. Clover stood. The entire staff stopped talking. She didn't stand well. Her legs wobbled, back knees buckled for a second. But she held herself upright. And then, shaking, unsteady, she took one step forward. Then another. She reached the fence. Ranger stopped a foot away. Saturday, then, with the kind of reverence Jamie had only seen at gravesides or in old soldiers, he laid down slowly, his body curled tight, his head low. His eyes, always alert, always watching, softened. Clover reached out with her muzzle and touched the wire. Not searching, not sniffing, recognizing. Jamie's hand flew to her chest. The handler whispered, This is something science can't quantify." Ranger didn't move. He just lay there, eyes on her, tail barely flicking once, like a flicker of breath through a half-open window. Clover let out a soft sound. Not distress. Something lighter. Familiar. Then, as if the energy she'd hoarded for weeks suddenly unlocked, she turned and walked, slow, deliberate, across the enclosure. Her steps were clumsy but sure. "She's walking." Margot breathed behind Jamie, on her own. "She's following him," someone else added. Ranger didn't react with excitement. There was no tail-thumping joy, no bark. Just that quiet, unwavering attention that had become his language. Jamie crouched beside him, not touching, just sharing the moment. Her voice cracked as she said, "You stayed with her once. She's staying because of you now." Clover stopped halfway across the pen, turned her head slightly, then slowly lowered herself into the grass. Not from weakness, from choice. Peace settled over the enclosure like a blanket laid gently across open wounds. Jamie stood slowly, heart full, throat aching. "You carried her through," she whispered to Ranger. The pup didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. Everyone present understood. This wasn't training. This wasn't instinct. This was devotion, the kind that can't be taught, only chosen. And Ranger had chosen it again, without fanfare, without reward. As the handlers gently guided Jamie and Ranger back toward the gate, Clover's ears stayed pointed in his direction. Her body remained still, but something invisible reached between them like a thread pulled taut. Jamie turned to Margot. "What now?" Margot shook her head, stunned. Now we let her heal." As they walked back to the car, Ranger didn't pull away like last time. He walked beside Jamie, shoulder brushing lightly against her leg. She opened the car door, and he jumped in, curled up immediately, and let out a breath so long and deep it sounded like something had left him. Jamie looked at him through the rearview mirror. "That wasn't just a visit," she said. Ranger closed his eyes. It was closure. For 3 days, everything had felt lighter. Clover had begun standing without coaxing. She ate from the bottle with purpose. She even stepped around her pen, wobbling, sure-footed in a way none of the staff had dared hope for. The vet called it a turning point. And back at home, Ranger had started to settle in ways Jamie had only imagined. He followed Luke around the house like a silent shadow, rested near Jamie's desk when she worked late, even curled up by the fireplace with a kind of quiet contentment she hadn't seen in him since the first night. Until everything changed. It began with the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the wrong kind. The kind Jamie had learned to recognize in hospital rooms. A stillness that made the hairs on her arms rise. Ranger stopped eating. At first she thought it was nothing. A skipped meal. But then came the pacing. The long hours spent by the door again, nose pressed to the gap beneath it. The ears pricking at sounds only he could hear. Then came the night. Jamie found him sitting in the hallway, unmoving, his back to her. When she spoke, he didn't turn. His body was alert, but not tense, frozen in a kind of waiting that broke her heart all over again. She sat beside him whispering, "What is it, boy? What are you feeling?" No answer, but she didn't need one. The next morning, the call came. Margot, her voice tight. "Jamie, Clover's not doing well." Jamie's stomach dropped. What happened? "She's refusing food again. Won't respond to the texts. She collapsed once during routine movement. No fever, no infection. It's like she's fading." Jamie pressed her fingers to her temple, forcing herself to stay calm. "I know how this sounds," Margot said, "but I need to ask, can you bring Ranger back?" Jamie was already grabbing the keys. Ranger didn't need to be coaxed. The moment the back door opened, he walked straight to the car and jumped in without a glance back. The drive was different this time. No standing, no alert ears. He lay down on the back seat with his head between his paws, still as stone, like he knew where they were going, like he knew why. At the wildlife center, they bypassed formalities. The staff met them at the gate, faces pale, eyes hopeful but guarded. "She hasn't moved since morning," one tech said. "She's not in pain, just distant." They led Jamie and Ranger to the enclosure in silence. Clover lay curled beneath the shade cloth, legs tucked, chest barely rising. Her eyes opened halfway as they approached, but didn't focus. She didn't lift her head. Jamie felt her throat tighten. "Oh, God." Ranger stepped forward. Not in a rush, not with urgency, but with purpose. He reached the fence and paused. Then, slowly, he lowered himself to the ground, exactly like he had the first time. No sound, no movement, just presence. Clover didn't respond. Then softly, so soft Jamie almost missed it, Ranger let out a single whine. Short, broken, her ears twitched. Jamie stepped forward, gripping the fence. Ranger whined again, this time a little louder. And then, Clover lifted her head. Her eyes blinked, slow and deliberate. She looked straight at him. Ranger didn't move, but something in his posture shifted, shoulders softening, breath evening out. Clover rose. Not fully. Her legs trembled, almost gave. But she stood. The vet on site gasped audibly. One of the techs let out a whispered prayer. Clover stepped forward, unsteady, one hoof dragging slightly. She reached the fence, her nose pressed gently through the chain link, brushing Ranger's snout. Then she let out the tiniest bleat. Alive. Jamie covered her mouth. She heard him, Margot whispered. She felt him. She waited, Jamie said, and he came. For the next hour they didn't move. Clover stood the entire time, only sitting when Ranger lowered his head onto his paws, signaling rest. She mimicked him. Not a second before, by the time Jamie and Ranger left, Clover was eating. Small bites, but consistent. She's back, Margot said quietly. Whatever this is between them, it's real. Jamie nodded. Her chest ached, not from fear, but from something else. Recognition. Ranger didn't pace that night. He didn't wait at the door. He lay in the center of the living room, body stretched long, breath steady. And when Jamie turned off the light and whispered, "Good night, hero," his ears flicked once. She didn't need more than that. Because now she understood. He wasn't reacting to the world, he was part of it. And somehow that made all the difference. The sun had barely risen when Jamie parked at the edge of the wildlife release site, a quiet, fenced stretch of protected woodland just east of the Mackenzie River. The air still held the chill of night, and mist clung low to the earth, drifting slowly between the trees like breath. Luke stepped out first, hoodie zipped tight, hands buried in his pockets. Jamie followed, opening the back door of the Jeep without a word. Ranger leapt out in one clean motion, not eager, not wild, just present. He stood for a moment on the damp ground, nose lifting slightly to catch the wind. They didn't need instructions. The handlers knew. This wasn't procedure anymore, it was something else, something older than science. Margot nodded to Jamie quietly. "She's in the transport crate. Ready when you are." Jamie glanced at Luke. He nodded. The walk to the clearing was short but carried weight. Every step seemed to echo against something larger than the moment itself. Ranger walked ahead of them, body low but calm. There was no tension in his gait, no searching, just steady awareness. At the edge of the clearing, a handler opened the crate. Clover stood inside. No trembling now, no collapsing legs or distant stares. She looked out at the woods with quiet clarity, her ears twitching at each rustle, each bird call. But she didn't move. Not until Ranger sat down. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He simply sat in the grass and looked at her. And Clover stepped out. The moment was so still, Jamie could hear her own breathing. Clover paused, nostrils flaring as she scanned the space, then began walking. Not away from them, but forward, toward the trees. She didn't rush, didn't bolt. Each step felt deliberate, like she was taking back her story one hoof at a time. And Ranger watched. When she reached the far line of trees, she turned, just slightly. Her eyes found them, then settled on him. A second passed, then another, and then Ranger did something that none of them expected. He gave a single nod. Barely perceptible, but everyone saw it. Clover looked one last time, then disappeared into the forest. No fanfare, no parting cry, just the trees swallowing her gently. Jamie placed a hand on Ranger's back. He didn't flinch, he didn't move. But after a few breaths, he turned around and walked back toward her. No hesitation, no looking over his shoulder. Luke watched them both, his voice quiet. He let her go. Jamie nodded, because he knew it was time. There was no need to explain it. Ranger had carried her through the worst, waited, guarded, and held steady when the world didn't. But now his job was done. And he knew it. They walked back in silence. Not the hollow kind, the sacred kind. When they reached the Jeep, Ranger jumped in without prompting. He lay down immediately, head resting on the seat edge, eyes soft. Jamie started the engine but didn't drive. She turned in her seat to look at him. "You didn't chase her," she said softly. You just watched her go. Ranger didn't move, but he exhaled. Long, deep, final. Luke looked out the window. Do you think he's sad? Jamie shook her head. I think he's free. No one said anything for a long time. The road home was winding, familiar now. The trees slipped past, casting broken shadows across the windshield. In the back seat, Ranger slept. Not fitfully like before, but fully. The way someone does when they've put something heavy down. At home, Ranger walked inside and headed straight for the rug in the center of the living room. He didn't go to the door, didn't glance at the windows. He just lay down, present, not guarding, just being. And that night, for the first time since he came into their lives, Ranger didn't stir when the wind tapped against the house. He didn't lift his head when the porch creaked or when the trees whispered outside. He slept, because she was safe, because he had stayed, because it was time to begin again. It started with a glance. A girl no older than 8 sat cross-legged on the edge of the therapy circle, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, eyes locked on the floor. She hadn't spoken in weeks, the counselors had said. Not since her brother died in a house fire. Not a word. Not even a nod. Ranger didn't bark when Jamie walked him into the small, gym-turned support space. He didn't tug at the leash or greet anyone with wagging excitement. He simply walked to the edge of the room, looked around, and lay down. Near her. Not close enough to scare her, not far enough to be missed. The girl looked up. That was all, and the silence in the room shifted. Jamie had enrolled Ranger in the Children's Resilience Animal Therapy program only a week earlier. She hadn't expected much. He wasn't a classic therapy dog, no formal training, no certificate framed on the wall. But he had something more important. Presence. He didn't demand. He didn't distract. He just stayed. The program facilitator, a retired child trauma therapist named Dana, had taken one look at Ranger and said, "He doesn't need training. He already knows." Ranger lay near the girl for the entire session. At one point, he scooted forward an inch, then another, never touching her, just getting closer. When the hour ended and kids began standing, grabbing juice boxes and crayons, the girl remained still. She turned to Dana and said softly, "Can he come back?" The first words she'd spoken in 24 days. Dana blinked away tears. Of course he can. Back at home, Luke sat on the porch with a sandwich in one hand and a pencil in the other. He was sketching again, something he hadn't done since Clover's release. Ranger lay at his feet, chin resting on Luke's shoelaces. "You know he stayed with me all night when I had that dream last week?" Luke said casually, eyes still on his drawing. Jamie looked up from her gardening gloves. "I didn't know that. I didn't even call for him." Luke added, "He just knew." He set the pencil down. "I told Owen at school. He asked why we never bring a dog to show and tell." Jamie smiled. "And what'd you say?" "I said our dog doesn't do tricks. He does silence." She laughed. "That's pretty accurate." Luke looked down at Ranger, then back at her. "Can I take him with me when I go volunteer next week?" Jamie raised a brow. "To the library reading group?" "Yeah. Some of the kids don't read out loud. Maybe they would with him." It was the kind of thing Luke wouldn't have suggested a month ago. The kind of thing he wouldn't have dared. Jamie nodded. "I think he'd like that." At the next therapy session, a boy with trembling hands sat beside Ranger and whispered, "You're not scary. You're like me." Ranger didn't flinch. He leaned ever so slightly into the boy's side. A teenage girl who hadn't made eye contact with anyone in weeks leaned over and brushed her fingers along Ranger's fur. "He listens better than most people." Jamie sat nearby, listening, watching. Ranger, in his quiet way, was reaching into places adults couldn't touch, places wounded too early by grief, abandonment, or things children shouldn't have to name. He didn't fix them. He didn't try. He simply stayed. That night, Jamie sat on the floor of the living room while Luke sprawled on the couch, one arm draped over Ranger's back. "Did you ever think he'd be ours?" Luke asked. Jamie looked at them, her son healing, laughing again. The puppy who once refused food and sleep, now snoring gently against the couch. "I think he always was," she said. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no newspaper articles or TV features, just quiet shifts. Kids beginning to read out loud. A boy speaking in full sentences again. Luke waving to neighbors. Jamie laughing without feeling guilty for it. Ranger changed them. Not with noise, not with energy, but with the soft, persistent weight of being present. And every time he walked into that therapy room and a child reached out, Jamie was reminded, he hadn't just saved Clover. He hadn't just waited in the woods. He had chosen this life, the hard one, and he was still choosing. Every single day. The barn had been converted into a gallery for the evening, a quiet space lit with strings of warm bulbs, the wooden beams dressed in ivy and soft banners. Volunteers bustled at folding tables lined with local art, hand-knit blankets, and photos of rescued animals, but the centerpiece stood along the back wall. It wasn't framed in gold. It didn't need to be. A single photo, printed large, in black and white, captured the moment Ranger lay across the wounded fawn, eyes locked with the camera, dirt and dried blood clinging to his fur. The caption read, "The Guardian of the Fawn." Jamie stood in front of it longer than she meant to, not because the image surprised her, but because of everything it didn't show. It didn't show the hours he spent pacing doorways, refusing food. It didn't show the quiet visits with children who had lost siblings, parents, homes. It didn't show how Ranger leaned into a child's shoulder so gently you'd think he was afraid to disturb a thought. It didn't show the weight he had carried, only that he had carried it. "You think he understands?" a familiar voice asked beside her. Luke, taller now, sharper at the edges, but still with that quiet softness in his voice. Jamie looked at him. "I think he understands more than most people ever will." Luke tucked his sketch pad under one arm. "They want us in the back for the raffle." "In a minute," she said. She turned back to the photo, eyes tracing the lines of that small body draped protectively over Clover's fragile frame. Ranger lay not far from them now, curled beneath the donation table, his body still but his ears tuned to every sound in the room. He'd already been approached by two children, one who sat down next to him and read aloud from a picture book, the other who just leaned her forehead gently against his side for a few silent minutes. No commands, no tricks, just presence. Jamie turned to Luke. "What makes someone a hero?" He blinked at her, then smiled. "Just slightly, someone who stays," he said, "even when it hurts." Jamie felt her throat tighten. She glanced at Ranger, who looked up briefly, met her eyes, and then rested his head back on his paws with a breath that seemed to say, "You don't have to ask anymore. I'm already here." Later that evening, as guests filtered out into the night air and volunteers folded chairs, Jamie watched Luke settle into a corner and begin sketching again. Not Clover, not the fawn. This time it was Ranger, resting under a tree, eyes half closed, framed by soft light and open space. Outside, cicadas buzzed. A few last children waved goodbye. Someone turned off the string lights. But inside, in that final quiet, Jamie felt the story settle. Not with a dramatic ending, but with a question. A gentle one. The kind that doesn't demand an answer but invites it. What's your story with a loyal pet? Because somewhere, someone is holding on. Staying. Waiting. Even when it hurts. And sometimes that's what makes them a hero. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone about Ranger, about Clover, about the moments that don't make the headlines, but save lives anyway. Join the German Shepherd community. Be their voice, be their home, be the one who stays.